My husband's best friend, Mark, made a bet with him. He bet him $100 that I'd fall apart the second he served me with divorce papers during our family Christmas dinner. Women are just so predictable. He slurred, his laugh echoing from the living room. I signed the documents right then and there, then handed them a beautifully wrapped gift. Their faces went pale as they unwrapped it. Think she'll actually cry when she sees them. Mark's voice floated down the hallway. They had no idea I was standing right there, frozen, a tray of drinks in my hands, my breath hitched in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs. Daniel's voice chimed in, dripping with a smug, easy confidence. She'll completely fall apart. They always do. That conversation took place 5 days before Christmas. But before we get into the thick of it, I just want to say thank you for being here. If you believe that no one should ever be made to feel powerless in their own life, let alone in their own home, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It's completely free. And your support helps us reach more people who deserve to find their voice instead of being silenced. Okay, let's get back to the story. This whole thing didn't really begin there, not in that hallway. The real unraveling started much earlier, long before they placed a wager on my emotional collapse. It started with laughter. It was always with a laugh. You know, I could just pack up and leave you tomorrow, right? Daniel would say at dinner parties, a playful glint in his eyes that never quite reached them, his hand rubbing my shoulder in a show of false affection. The whole table would let out a nervous chuckle, and I would too. But inside, a small part of me would shrivel up, twisting into a tight, hard knot just below my ribs. People didn't understand the real weight of those words, not how often he said them or how easily they slipped off his tongue. They didn't see the pattern. They didn't notice when I stopped wearing my favorite red dress just because he had scoffed one night. Aren't we trying a little too hard? They didn't notice how I started mentally rehearsing my sentences before speaking in public, trying to read his mood before I dared to open my mouth, praying that whatever I said wouldn't set off one of his long, patronizing speeches about my supposed shortcomings. He never shouted. He never laid a hand on me. Daniel was much too smart for that. His weapons weren't his fists, they were his words. But they were blades dipped in honey, so the cut felt sweet right before the poison set in. Don't embarrass me in front of my boss. You know you're lucky I'm still around, right? And his personal favorite, I mean seriously, what would you even do without me? Each jab came with a charming smile, a casual laugh, the clink of his whiskey glass against his teeth, and I had learned my part perfectly. I would just smile right back. In the beginning, I would defend him to my friends. Oh, he's just being sarcastic, I told Chloe, my best friend since we were in kindergarten, after she overheard one of his comments at a summer barbecue. He doesn't really mean it like that. She gave me a look that was filled with doubt. It doesn't matter if he means it, Steph. You look like you're shrinking. And maybe I was. I stopped posting on my social media. I started skipping my book club meetings, offering weak excuses. Calls and texts from my sister Sarah went unanswered more and more often. My whole world had contracted, becoming a tiny universe that revolved entirely around Daniel's moods, his schedule, his constantly moving goalposts for what would annoy him. He craved control, but the subtle kind. When my mother came to visit for a weekend, he made sure to remind me, right in front of her, how messy I'd left the kitchen that morning, just loud enough for her to hear my failure. When I forgot to pick up his dry cleaning after a long day at my own job, he'd mutter "useless" under his breath as he walked by. Just loud enough for the word to hit its mark, but just quiet enough that he could deny ever saying it. Still, I told myself this was just what marriage was. Maybe not the fairy tale I had dreamed of, but it was stable. It was a long-term commitment. At least he wasn't cheating on me. At least he wasn't violent. At least. Then came the corporate gala. It was a major fundraiser for his company, and we were about 2 glasses of champagne deep when he turned to me. His eyes glazed over with a mix of alcohol and pure disdain. "You're just like all of them," he muttered under his breath, as the CEO's wife glided by in a sparkling evening gown, always wanting more. Always so clingy, so needy. My mouth went instantly dry, my face burned with that familiar hot sting of shame. I didn't bother asking what had prompted his remark. I rarely did anymore. When we got home, he slammed the car door and went straight to the liquor cabinet. I followed him with slow, deliberate steps, poured him another drink from the decanter, and handed it to him with a smile I had practiced to perfection in the mirror. "You know," I said, my voice soft, "maybe we should sign something. Just in case. You're always joking about leaving. Why not make it official?" He let out a deep, careless laugh that echoed through the quiet house. "You seriously think I need a prenup to protect my fantasy football winnings?" He grabbed a pen from the junk drawer and scribbled his name on a cardboard coaster sitting on the end table. "There," he sneered, flicking it at me. "Go get it notarized if you're that worried." Then he collapsed onto the couch and passed out. By the next morning, he had completely forgotten about that coaster, but I hadn't. I had it notarized within 24 hours. My friend Chloe helped. She didn't ask a single question, just looked at me with a quiet, deep understanding in her eyes and handed me a pen. I folded that document carefully, slid it into a fireproof envelope, and tucked it deep in the back of a filing cabinet, hidden beneath a thick folder labeled Tax Receipts 2020. Then I went to a print shop, scanned it, and emailed a digital copy to a private, encrypted email account Chloe had helped me set up years before, just in case. That night, I cooked dinner just like any other night. I asked Daniel about his day. I laughed at his impressions of his coworkers. I cleared the dishes and wiped down the counters while he scrolled blankly on his phone. He didn't notice the change in the way I had started looking at him. It wasn't with fear anymore, and it wasn't with anger. It was with cold, hard calculation. Over the next few weeks, something fundamental shifted inside of me. It wasn't anything you could see, nothing dramatic, but I started keeping a journal. Not one of those pretty leather-bound ones with inspirational quotes on the cover, but a plain, spiral-bound notebook that I kept tucked securely under my side of the mattress. In it, I meticulously logged his comments, his moods, the exact date he stumbled home at 1:15 a.m., smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine and cheap tequila. I wasn't planning anything specific yet, not consciously. But that night, at his company's New Year kickoff party, when he announced to a group of new hires, "My wife's main hobby is overspending," I didn't cry. I excused myself to the restroom, stared at my reflection in the mirror, and a single thought crystallized in my mind. He thinks I'm weak. He thinks I'm breakable. He wasn't wrong. I had been, but I was learning. A few months later, while I was folding laundry, I found a receipt crumpled in the pocket of his jeans. 2 glasses of Chardonnay, an expensive hotel room, and a side of chocolate-covered strawberries from room service. The date on it was Valentine's Day, a day we had spent apart because he'd claimed he was out of town for a mandatory work conference. I didn't confront him. I didn't scream or cry. I simply took it, scanned it, saved it, and locked it away with the other pieces of evidence. It became a quiet, methodical pattern, a private ritual. I was gathering facts, not wallowing in feelings. At dinner one evening, he looked at me and said, "If we ever split, you'll be crawling back within a week. You can't even figure out how to fix the Wi-Fi without me." I just nodded, poured him another glass of wine, and said, "That's true." But I no longer believed it. There's a very specific kind of silence that grows and festers in a house like ours. It's not a peaceful quiet. It's tight, like a thread pulled too taut through fabric, just waiting to snap. Every room in our house echoed with the arguments we never had. Every smile I put on was accompanied by a wave of nausea. Then, one night, I woke up from a nightmare, his voice echoing in my dream, repeating, "You'll have nothing. You'll have nothing." I sat bolt upright in bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs. And in that moment, a quiet little voice whispered from somewhere deep inside me, "That's not true anymore." I had the document, I had the records, and I had time. That was the night I stopped pretending. From that point on, I wasn't just his wife, I was his shadow. Polite, polished, watching, preparing. The joke he thought was so harmless, the coaster he thought was just a drunken whim, that was my foundation. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew that one day he'd reach for that same old tired power play, and this time, I'd be ready. I stood in Chloe's office, the fluorescent lights humming softly above us, casting a harsh glow on the sharp, crisp edges of a truth I still wasn't quite ready to say out loud. She stared at the document I had handed her, the one Daniel had drunkenly signed without a second thought, without even reading it. Did he do this willingly? She asked, her eyebrows raised so high they almost disappeared into her hairline. I just nodded, unable to find my voice. Chloe leaned back in her big leather office chair, which let out a soft groan. She put on her reading glasses and began to read. After a few long, quiet minutes, she looked up at me, and there was a look in her eyes that was a mix of pity and pure admiration. "It's elegant," she said, tapping the paper gently with her finger. "He handed you the knife, Steph. You're just deciding when to use it." I sat across from her, my fingers laced so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned white. "I don't want revenge, Chloe. I just want to feel safe." "You will," she said, her voice firm, "but let's reinforce this. Let's make absolutely certain it will hold up if he ever decides to file first." And that's exactly what we did. She drafted a formal addendum, adding clarity where there was ambiguity, ensuring that if Daniel ever tried to spin the narrative, he'd be hopelessly ensnared by his own arrogance. We included provisions he'd never even think to question: spousal protections, detailed financial splits, and clear evidence of voluntary signing. He had written his name. He had dated it. It was in his own handwriting. There was no coercion, no pressure, just one smug, careless moment that had now become irreversible. Chloe handed me a flash drive, a printed copy for my records, and gave me a look I hadn't seen from her since we were kids, plotting mischief behind the school library. Except this time, it wasn't mischief. It was strategy. And we were playing the long game. "I'll hold on to a copy, too," she said as I stood to leave, "just in case." That night, I came home to find Daniel sprawled on the couch watching a football game, a beer in his hand, his socks tossed carelessly on the living room floor. I paused in the doorway, watching him laugh at a replay on the screen, the sound from the TV bouncing off the walls like echoes from a life I no longer felt a part of. "Dinner's almost ready," I said. He just grunted in response. That was the beginning of my performance. And I played the part better than I ever thought I could. I became the wife he bragged about to his colleagues, polished, pleasant, perfectly composed. When he made comments about my spending habits in front of our friends, I laughed along with him. When he boasted about his promotion at his company's annual party, I kissed his cheek and toasted him with a bright, dazzling smile, even though I knew he only got the job because his supervisor was desperate to get him out of his department. I no longer pushed back when he was cruel. I complimented his taste in wine, his choice of restaurant, even his new aftershave, though it smelled nothing like the one he used to wear when we first started dating. He thought I was softening. What he didn't see was that I was sharpening. Daniel began to relax again, believing that the fight in me had finally been extinguished. His behavior grew more careless, more entitled. He started coming home late without bothering to invent excuses. He left his phone face up on the counter where messages would flash briefly across the screen from numbers saved without names. I saw one of them. It read, "Tonight, same hotel." He left for the gym 10 minutes later. I calmly opened our shared laptop, synced his phone's data to my private cloud folder, and forwarded the screenshots to the encrypted email account Chloe had set up for me. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I went to the kitchen and made lasagna, his favorite. He came home to a hot meal and a warmer smile. He said it was the best he'd had all week. At a barbecue a few weeks later, his best friend Mark cornered him near the grill, his beer sloshing as he gestured wildly. "She'll fall apart if you ever leave her, man," he laughed. "Too dependent. You've got it made." I was standing just a few feet away, carefully arranging a fruit tray. I didn't flinch then either. Instead, I placed the strawberries in a perfect, decorative spiral, one red slice at a time. Daniel joined me moments later and wrapped his arm around my waist, pressing a kiss to my cheek as if he hadn't disappeared for the entire night before without a word. "You look beautiful today," he said. I smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart." The day after that barbecue, I started recording phone calls, only the ones that mattered. The quiet late-night conversations when he slipped up, said too much, laughed too hard at things no loving husband should ever find funny. I labeled each audio file by date and stored them meticulously in my digital fortress. I felt like a spy in my own home, but I wasn't seeking revenge, not really. I was building a parachute, quietly, carefully. Because when you live in a house full of cracks, you don't wait for it to collapse on top of you. You learn exactly where to step and when to jump. I even bought a planner and began marking days with tiny, innocent-looking symbols, an X for his late nights, a star for suspicious credit card charges, a dot for lies I could definitively prove. To anyone else, it looked like grocery lists and meal plans. To me, it was a map. Eventually, I stopped reacting at all. I became a perfect mirror. He saw in me only what he wanted to see, a woman who had finally given up, who had shrunk herself down to fit neatly into the narrow, suffocating box he had built for her. And so, he got bold. He started leaving large amounts of cash out in the open, withdrawals he never bothered to explain. He went on business trips with luggage full of cologne and freshly pressed shirts he would never need for a few Zoom calls. One day, I found a lipstick stain on a receipt from a bar. The shade was called Temptress Red. I wasn't offended. I just made a note of it. The final confirmation came 2 weeks before Christmas. Daniel had a few too many drinks and fell asleep on the couch with his phone unlocked in his hand. I glanced down as a message thread lit up the screen. "Em, she doesn't suspect a thing. I'll file on Christmas. Want front row seats." Attached was a laughing emoji and a GIF of a woman sobbing uncontrollably into a tissue. My fingers didn't tremble. My stomach didn't lurch. I read the message twice, took a screenshot, and emailed it away into my secure folder. Then I deleted any trace of my snooping from his phone. That night, as I lay in bed beside him, I stared up at the ceiling and thought about candles, cranberries, and a carved turkey. Christmas. He was planning my public humiliation like it was a party trick. He thought I would break. But I had already chosen the date. I had already chosen the witnesses. And I had already chosen the setting. He wasn't the only one with a performance ready, because he had forgotten something absolutely critical. When you hand someone a knife, you don't get to act surprised when they finally learn how to use it. The Christmas table looked like something straight out of a home decor magazine. It was perfect, meticulously arranged, and completely fake in its warmth. A flickering garland of pine and holly framed the windows, candles danced in their glass holders, and the roast turkey glistened under Daniel's carving knife as he grinned like a proud patriarch. He was wearing the sweater I had bought him last year, a maroon wool one with small, festive reindeer stitched across the chest. The irony of it all, me dressing the very man who was plotting my public downfall, was not lost on me. My sister, Sarah, passed around her famous spiced wine. Her cheeks flushed from both the heat of the oven and the alcohol. Daniel's parents chattered on about their retirement plans in Florida. Everyone looked so happy, so blissfully ignorant. I moved among them like a hostess on autopilot, refilling glasses, smiling with my teeth, but not with my eyes. Beneath my black dress, my legs were trembling, but it wasn't from fear. It was from pure, unadulterated anticipation. My heart beat a steady, determined rhythm. Tonight, tonight, tonight. Daniel caught my eye once while he was slicing the turkey and gave me a conspiratorial wink. He had a particular look about him, overconfident and deeply self-satisfied. the same way he used to look right before closing a big sales pitch. I matched his smile with one of my own, warm and completely unreadable. Let him think he'd won. "Best bird yet," his dad said, chewing enthusiastically. "Steph's perfected the recipe," Daniel added, placing the platter on the table like it was a trophy he'd earned. "She's had plenty of practice." "What is this, our 7th Christmas together?" "8th," I corrected him gently, taking my seat across from him. He raised his glass. "Well, here's to 8 more. Or, however many we last." His voice held that familiar, cruel edge again, the one he coated in a thin layer of humor to make his jabs feel casual and deniable. Laughter rippled around the table. I chuckled too, brushing an imaginary crumb from my napkin. As the plate started to empty and the warm buzz of wine settled comfortably over the room, I noticed Daniel's best friend, Mark, whisper something in his ear. Mark was already tipsy, his eyes glassy, his smirk lopsided. Daniel nodded slowly and stood up, tapping his glass with a butter knife to get everyone's attention. "All right, everyone," he said, clearing his throat dramatically. "Before we get to dessert, I have a little something for my lovely wife." I glanced at my sister, Sarah, who gave me a smile of genuine delight, probably thinking he was about to give me a necklace or a sweet handwritten note. Daniel reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, pulled out a stark white envelope, and walked over to me with the unbearable smugness of a man who believed he was about to deliver a grand, show-stopping finale. "Merry Christmas, babe," he said, placing it deliberately on the table in front of me. A quiet, guttural chuckle escaped from Mark. No one else laughed. The envelope was jarringly out of place. Plain white, no bow, no card. I looked at it for a long moment before calmly opening it. The table went quiet. My eyes scanned the first line. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Already signed, already filed. He had even highlighted a section at the bottom, like a schoolboy showing off his homework. I looked up. His smile was wide, expectant. So I smiled back. "Thank you," I said softly, almost sweetly. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Mark shifted uncomfortably beside him. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a sleek silver pen. I clicked it open. I signed the papers in one smooth, elegant stroke. I dated it. I capped the pen and handed them back. Done. I could feel Sarah's stare on me, her eyes wide. Daniel blinked, completely thrown. "That's it?" he asked, his voice a little too casual. "That's it," I echoed, sliding the envelope back toward him. Then, without missing a beat, I reached under the table and lifted a heavy, gold-wrapped box, placing it squarely on the table right between his plate and his shattered ego. "What's this?" he asked, his voice wary. "Your real gift," I said. He hesitated, then tore at the wrapping paper, revealing a leather-bound folder. He opened it, and the moment he read the first line, all the color drained from his face. His lips moved silently for a moment, reading and then rereading. Dated. Notarized. Ironclad. The postnuptial agreement he had laughed his way through, signed with the same hand that was now clutching the edge of the table for support. "What is this?" Mark asked, leaning in to see. Daniel didn't answer. So I did. "It's the agreement. The agreement Daniel signed nearly a year ago. It's been updated, reinforced, and filed with the court." "But I filed first," Daniel stammered, as if that simple fact could undo reality. "Which makes it legally binding under your own terms," I replied, a calm smile playing on my lips. "Every asset, every clause, you gave it all to me." Mark's mouth hung slightly open. "Holy. You okay, man?" Sarah's husband asked from across the table. Daniel didn't respond. His eyes were still glued to the document, the same eyes that once scanned spreadsheets and contracts for the tiniest errors had missed this one massive one in his own life. And then I reached into my purse one last time. "One last thing," I said. I placed a small square envelope on the table, much thinner than the first. He stared at it as if it might bite him. He opened it slowly, his brows furrowed in confusion. Inside was a sonogram photo. Daniel looked at it, then at me. "I'm pregnant," I said, my voice perfectly even. 8 weeks today. His expression cracked, just slightly. His eyes darted around the table. For one fleeting, involuntary moment, he smiled, but that smile withered and died the second his brain caught up with his ego. Post-nup, pregnancy, assets, custody. The room felt like it was tilting on its axis. The weight of everything he thought he controlled was now pressing down on him like a slab of concrete. "You planned this," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. I met his eyes, my gaze steady and cold. "You bet I'd cry. You laughed. You called me predictable. So no, Daniel, I didn't plan anything. I prepared." The silence that followed was thick, dense with the kind of crushing realization that doesn't crash down but slowly seeps in. I took a sip of my wine. The sweetness of cinnamon and clove clung to my lips. Daniel's mother pushed her chair back slightly, her face ashen. Sarah gently reached for my hand under the table, her thumb brushing against mine in a silent gesture of solidarity. Mark tried to speak but just ended up shaking his head and looking away. Daniel stared at the post-nup as if he could rewrite it with sheer force of will. He couldn't. I stood up slowly and began clearing the dessert plates that had not yet been filled. My hands didn't shake. My breath was even. "Apple pie or pecan?" I asked the table at large. No one answered. Daniel sat frozen, flanked by the wreckage of his own grand illusion. And well, I wasn't broken. I was just getting started. Daniel just sat there, his shoulders rigid, his mouth slightly open as if the words he'd just said had gotten stuck in his throat. "You planned this." But I could barely hear him anymore. He was staring at the legal document in front of him like it was some ancient curse carved into stone. The only problem was he had written every damning line himself. The room was painfully quiet, except for the subtle crackle of the fireplace and the slow clink of a spoon from the kitchen. Even the ornaments on the Christmas tree seemed to be holding their breath. Then, his gaze fell to the sonogram photo still lying in his lap. He looked at it as if it might disappear if he blinked. The faintest twitch pulsed in his jaw. "Steph," he started, but I stood a little straighter. "No." Just that one word, spoken calmly but with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. He blinked slowly, as if he was trying to figure out which version of me he was actually talking to. His voice cracked. "You don't have to do this." "Oh, but I'm not doing anything," I replied, lifting my wine glass without even looking at him. "You already did." To my right, his mother sat hunched forward, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line, the pearls around her neck trembling with every shallow breath she took. His father had taken off his glasses and was meticulously cleaning them with the edge of his napkin, even though they weren't smudged. Sarah's husband reached for more wine and then thought better of it. Mark, still seated awkwardly at the end of the table, just scratched the back of his neck, the weight of his own smugness now collapsing on him like a ton of bricks. My cousin Rachel stared at me from across the table, her eyes wide, her spoon hovering halfway between her mouth and her bowl of untouched sweet potatoes. I scanned their faces slowly, taking in every single expression: disbelief, shame, confusion, awe. It was better than any speech I could have ever given. Their collective silence was the standing ovation I never needed to ask for. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. It was a nervous habit, something he did when he realized he'd lost control. I'd seen it before, during arguments with his boss, while trying to talk his way out of a late credit card payment, when a deal fell through and there was no one left to blame. He looked around the room as if someone might swoop in and rescue him. No one did. "You thought I'd beg?" I said quietly. My voice didn't waver. My hands didn't tremble. "You thought I'd fall apart. You were half right." He looked at me again, his eyes narrowed. I continued, "until today." He swallowed, loudly. That was the moment I saw real fear creep in, not the theatrical, angry kind. No yelling, no tantrum, just a flicker, a sliver of something genuine in a man who had always treated consequences as if they were for other people. Daniel opened his mouth again, but before he could speak, his phone buzzed against the polished wood of the table. He glanced down at it. Another buzz, then a third. He picked it up slowly, unlocking it with a shaky thumb. And there it was, the email from Chloe. Subject line, post-nuptial confirmation, legally binding. I watched his face twist in slow, quiet horror as he read the words. Each sentence seemed to strip another layer from his bravado. His thumb scrolled frantically. His lips parted. His skin went pale. He reached the bottom where Chloe had signed off with her firm's official letterhead and her usual touch of professional elegance. She had even attached backup copies of everything, complete with metadata timestamps. Ironclad. "Tell her it doesn't count," he muttered, gripping the phone like it might obey him. Another buzz. This time, it was a notification from his father's email. The subject line read, FWD, signed post-nup dated documents, FYI. The man he once condescendingly called a legal dinosaur had just received definitive proof that his golden boy had handed over his entire future on a silver platter. Daniel lowered the phone as if it had burned his hand. I turned towards Sarah, who had been quietly watching the whole thing unfold. "I could go for something sweet now," I said softly, my voice almost cheerful. "Can you pass the pie?" "Which one?" she asked, recovering quickly. "Apple, and whipped cream, please." As she began slicing into the pie, I stepped away from the table, moved to the buffet counter, and picked up a clean plate. Daniel's eyes followed my every move, still wide, still trying to catch up. I returned to my seat beside my sister, placing the pie gently in front of me. From my seat, I turned to him one last time that night. "I'll have the locks changed tomorrow," I said simply. He looked like he'd been slapped. Then I picked up my fork, took a bite of pie, and smiled, not to provoke him, not for show. Just because the cinnamon was warm, the crust was buttery, and the taste reminded me of something I had forgotten long ago. Peace. Daniel pushed his chair back so hard the legs scraped across the hardwood floor. "You think you've won," he spat. I didn't respond. He didn't deserve one. He stormed out of the room, leaving the post-nup, the sonogram, and the tattered remains of his pride on the dining table. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Sarah let out a sharp breath beside me. "I always hated that sweater," she muttered. A ripple of laughter went through the room, soft and unsure at first, then growing. Rachel giggled nervously. Even Daniel's mother let out a faint chuckle, covering her mouth with a napkin, though she quickly looked away. I took another bite of pie and leaned in to Sarah. "Merry Christmas," I whispered. She rested her head briefly against my shoulder. There were no fireworks, no shouting, no overturned chairs or broken dishes. Just a quiet, methodical dismantling of power, measured in legal documents, shared glances, and a single slice of dessert. The room shifted that night. Not because I changed the dynamic, but because I took it back. Sarah stayed the night. After Daniel slammed the door behind him, she just looked at me and said, "You're not waking up alone tomorrow." She didn't have to say anything else. We slept in the guest room, me curled on my side with one hand resting on the slight curve of my belly. Her hand brushed mine briefly in the dark, a wordless and warm gesture. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding my breath for the past few years until that night. When I finally let it out, it felt like it belonged to someone else, someone I didn't recognize. By morning, Daniel was gone. No note, no call, just silence. I came downstairs and found the coffee pot cold, the front door locked from the inside, and his keys missing from the hook by the door. I made myself breakfast for the first time in weeks without having to second-guess the clink of my fork against the plate or the sound of the toaster popping. By 9 a.m., I had a locksmith on the phone. "Emergency or standard change?" the dispatcher asked. "Standard," I said, then paused. "But make it fast." He came that afternoon, a quiet man with kind eyes who didn't ask any questions when I handed him Daniel's old set of keys and said, "Make sure none of these work anymore." When he left, I stood in the foyer with a single new key in my hand and realized this was the first thing I had owned entirely on my own in years. Not the house itself, not yet, but the feeling, the certainty. That evening, I moved into the master bedroom. It still smelled faintly of his cologne, a trace of something expensive and cold. I opened every window, letting the crisp December air rush through the space. I stripped the sheets and bundled them into trash bags. In the back of the closet, I found an old box of sandalwood candles, ones I used to love before he said they gave him headaches. I lit 3 of them, set them on the dresser, and watched the soft light dance across the walls as if it was dancing just for me. The next day, his mail started arriving with bright red stamps across the envelopes. Final notice. Past due. Immediate action required. I stacked them neatly on a side table near the door. I didn't forward a single one. Chloe called that evening, her voice practically bubbling with excitement. "You won't believe this," she said. "Actually, you will." Daniel's lawyer called my office this morning. His face must have been priceless when he realized what you've been sitting on all this time. I smiled into the phone, curling up in my favorite blanket. "Is it official?" "He lost 70% overnight," she replied. "And with a baby on the way," she paused for dramatic effect, "he's going to be cutting a check so big he'll need a payment plan." My smile widened, not for the money, not even close, but for the profound relief of knowing I could finally sit in my own living room without bracing for a fight. "I'm proud of you," Chloe added softly. That was the one thing that nearly made me cry. "Thanks," I whispered, "for staying when I didn't even know I needed someone." "You've always been strong, Steph," she said. "You just finally let yourself believe it." The fallout was quiet at first, more like snow melting than a destructive avalanche. Some mutual friends unfollowed me on social media. A few chose sides. A few sent me cautious texts full of disclaimers like, "I'm not taking sides," but others were bolder. One message from a woman I hadn't spoken to in 2 years simply read, "I wish I had your strength." A bouquet of peonies arrived at my doorstep a few days later. There was no name, just a simple card that read, "About time." I knew it was from Daniel's former assistant. Of course she knew. I smiled and placed the flowers on the mantel. It was only a matter of time before word spread through his office. The man who had once made jokes about training wives like interns had suddenly lost his audience. His best friend Mark stopped laughing at his comments in meetings. The swagger was gone. Apparently, his team noticed he'd been leaving early, muttering under his breath and ignoring deadlines. I overheard Sarah's husband on the phone with someone later that week. "Nah, man. He's been off. Like, haunted." Haunted, good. The man who once told me I'd be nothing without him now walked alone at lunch, a ghost in a world that had once applauded his cruelty. As for me, I started buying lavender soap again. I painted the nursery a soft sage green, a color he once called pointless. I hung tiny string lights around the window and placed a stuffed giraffe in the corner. I started lighting candles after dinner and drinking herbal tea in the sunroom, barefoot and unbothered. One evening, I caught myself humming while folding laundry, something I hadn't done since our second anniversary. I bought new bed sheets, crisp white with tiny gold stars, and I slept diagonally across the mattress just because I could. One afternoon, I passed Daniel on the street. He was coming out of a bank, talking angrily into his phone, looking irritated and tired. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did and just didn't know what to say. I kept walking. Later, Chloe sent me a screenshot. Daniel's firm had quietly removed his name from their quarterly newsletter. I replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. Then I made myself a cup of tea and watched the wind dance through the curtains. It wasn't about revenge anymore. Not really. It was about the small things, freedom, peace. A slow, steady rebuilding of a life that belonged only to me, and the quiet realization that the woman he tried so hard to break was now the one who had rebuilt everything without him. The first time I felt her kick, I was standing barefoot in the kitchen, humming along to an old Nina Simone record while slicing peaches for a pie. It was so soft at first that I thought I had imagined it, a tiny flutter, like a butterfly wing brushing against the inside of my stomach. Then it came again, more deliberate this time. I dropped the knife on the cutting board. Both of my hands flew to my belly, and I just stood there, stunned and smiling, as tears I hadn't seen coming caught me completely off guard. It wasn't just a kick, it was a reminder, a rhythm, a message. You're not alone. She was real. She was growing. She was strong. And so was I. That night, I wrote in my journal for the first time in weeks. I kept the entry short but deliberate. This baby will never hear yelling through a closed door. She will never feel like she's walking on eggshells. She will never, ever confuse fear for love. I underlined that last line twice. My world had gotten smaller since the divorce, but it had also become warmer, softer in all the right places. My sister, Sarah, moved into the guest room during my second trimester. She arrived with 2 overstuffed suitcases and a basket of homemade muffins. She was wearing her usual oversized hoodie and the same gold hoop earrings she'd worn since college. "I'm not letting you do this alone," she announced. "And anyway, you need someone to stop you from eating pickles and ice cream for dinner." We fell into a comfortable rhythm almost immediately. She worked remotely from the kitchen table, wore fuzzy socks in July, and didn't ask about Daniel unless I brought him up first, which I rarely did. That part of my story was no longer worth telling. Chloe dropped by every few days with bags of groceries, warm casseroles, and baby name books with silly sticky notes attached. Page 37. Do not name her Tiffany. "Not because it's a bad name," she explained one afternoon, laughing over tea, "but because there was a Tiffany in my middle school who cut my hair with safety scissors during art class. We laughed more in those few months than I had in the last 5 years combined. We didn't talk about court filings or lawyers or any of the old wounds Daniel had left behind. We talked about recipes, crib colors, what kind of stroller folded the easiest, and whether her ex was secretly stalking her Pinterest boards for home decor ideas. It was the first time in a long, long time that silence wasn't something I feared, but something I could comfortably share. The baby's room took shape slowly. I painted the walls a soft, buttery yellow and filled it with thrifted furniture that I refinished myself, one coat of warm paint at a time. A rocking chair arrived in a giant, cumbersome box, and Sarah spent 3 hours trying to assemble it before throwing down the instructions in defeat and declaring, "This is your villain origin story." We laughed until our faces hurt. One quiet Sunday, I pulled a box from the back of the hallway closet. I knew what it was the moment my fingers touched the lid, the slight crackle of the satin ribbon, the faint scent of cedar clinging to the cardboard. Our wedding photos. I sat on the living room floor and opened it. There we were, frozen smiles and broken promises wrapped in white lace. His hands were around my waist, and my eyes were full of dreams that had since turned to ash. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I slid each photo out of the album and into a separate envelope. I labeled the box, "To Release." Then I drove to the local donation center, handed it over without a word, and walked away feeling lighter. On the way home, I stopped at a bookstore and bought a blank journal with a leather cover and thick ivory pages. That night, I titled the first page, "Plans That Are Only Mine." I wrote in it every evening. Some entries were long and detailed, some were just a single word, but every one of them belonged to me. By the time Christmas came around again, the air inside my house smelled like cinnamon and pine instead of stale tension. The dining table was smaller this time, cozier. There were no dramatic centerpieces, no wine glasses used as weapons of charm. There was laughter, real laughter, the kind that bubbles up without any effort. My sister brought her toddler, who kept gleefully dropping mashed potatoes on the floor and yelling, "Uh-oh!" with the pride of a magician who had just pulled off a grand trick. My dad carved the turkey while Sarah tried and failed to make a respectable vegan gravy. Chloe brought a date, her first in over a year, and I didn't feel a single pang of jealousy. I just felt full. And next to my nephew sat a brand new high chair, white with little yellow stars, holding the new love of my life, my daughter. She had his eyes, maybe, but the rest of her? All mine. Her cheeks were full and pink from the cold winter air. Her tiny fingers gripped the edge of her tray while she babbled nonsense like it was the most important speech ever given. I didn't spend the evening watching the door. I wasn't checking my tone or rehearsing answers in my head. I didn't wonder if someone's compliment might trigger a subtle jab from across the table. I was just present. Every bite of food, every shared glance, every story told between courses felt like a celebration, not of survival, but of something entirely new. After dinner, I curled up in the armchair by the fireplace, my daughter asleep on my chest, her tiny breaths warming the fabric of my sweater. Everyone else had drifted to the kitchen or gone out for a late-night walk in the snow, but I stayed behind, just holding her, surrounded by the kind of deep, quiet peace that used to feel completely fictional. I took a sip of my cocoa and whispered to her softly, "He said I'd be nothing without him." She stirred slightly in her sleep, her little fingers curling around mine. I kissed her forehead and smiled. "Turns out," I murmured into the quiet room, "I'm everything without him." This story of calm power and perfect timing gave you chills, didn't it? Hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when she slid that gold-wrapped box across the table. What was your favorite moment? Tell me in the comments below. For more stories of strength, smart revenge, and emotional justice, subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss a single moment. End of story.